There were several pilots gathered around us. When I asked if any of them had been in mortal danger, Captain Cromie looked at me as if he wanted to pierce me through. I had gotten used to those looks and didn't particularly react to them. And this time, when I asked my rather banal question, typical of the newspapermen who then write all sorts of nonsense about undaunted bravery in mortal combat, I foresaw in advance that I would meet the glare of Captain Hromer's mocking green eyes. I immediately began to tell about one of my flights, during which I really had to go through a lot. I thought it would be easier to get more details out of the guys. The trick worked. I found the right tone, and everyone there wanted to share their memories. The last thing I expected was that Lieutenant Soucek would be the first to fall for this trick. He always seemed timid and silent to me. By the time he had already 25 combat missions and 4 air battles to his credit, he was not yet 23 years old. He was a tall, sturdy, and obviously very strong man with blonde hair and good-natured blue eyes. He gave the impression of an industrious and brave but reserved fellow, accustomed to the hard labour of a ploughman or a woodcutter. Subaltern Soucek spoke with a noticeable Russian accent, and this was not surprising. A Pole by nationality, he was born and raised in the Soviet Union. About what happened to him during the battles on the Vistula, Soucek told literally in a few words. A shell hit the engine crankcase of his airplane. It happened at the moment when Soucek, having fired on German tanks attacking the rebel positions, soared above the roofs of the burning houses of Warsaw. A sharp jolt ripped the control stick out of his hands, and the plane, whirling, began to deviate from the course. Soucek was sure that the shell had damaged the steering. He immediately realized that there was no escape, as he was separated from the ground only some 200 meters, and he would not even be able to use a parachute. Still, Soucek instinctively grabbed the handle and pulled it towards himself. And, oh wonder, the airplane returned to its previous position and went up. So, the steering is intact. The lieutenant looked at the instruments. The speed was normal, only the oil temperature was a little higher than usual, the fuel level. Oil pressure. There was something wrong here. The instrument pointer was frozen at 0. The pilot was so absorbed in his observations that he did not pay attention to the shells bursting around him. The engine was smoking heavily. The machine became heavier and was losing speed. Soucek was now flying straight toward the Vistula, expecting every minute that the engine was about to stall. And indeed, over the middle of the river, the engine seemed to choke. An ominous silence surrounded the pilot. He barely pulled over the Vava forest, and without releasing the landing gear to prevent overturning, landed the yak on its belly in a potato field near some highway. I have never felt such fear as I did then. That's all, said Soucek in his pleasant and melodious voice. I was scared too when we lost Li 2, said Lieutenant Podgorski. Just think, Li 2 with all the mechanics of the regiment. You know, he turned to me. We, changing the airfield, usually transported all the technical staff by air. Li 2 arrived. Our mechanics were stuffed into it like herrings in a barrel, and off to the new place under the careful supervision of a couple of yaks. That day we moved from Barnowko to Steinbeck, located northeast of Berlin and south of the Finau Canal, beyond the Oder. It was only some 60 kilometers. We, together with Lieutenant Lubetsky, were to accompany Lidois, this clumsy hulk, defenceless and helpless, like a calf separated from the herd in the forest among wolves. From Barnowko we flew for 9 days to reconnoitre the northern district of Berlin, Eberswalde, Finau, Angermünde and Freitzen. We knew this route by memory and, as it seemed to us, we could always get where we needed to go. And, of course, we did. But only without Li 2. He was lost in the fog over the Oder. We were worried sick. We'd find the airfield sooner or later anyway, but our mechanics, would they be found? From the very first day, as the regiment flew to the front, we have not had a single case that at least one airplane, which we were guarding, died through our fault. And now... Mentally, I already imagined that covered with shame inactive regiment removed from the front, and I stand before a military tribunal. First of all, we began to look for an airfield. Soon, Lubetsky spotted it at the edge of the forest at the junction of a highway with a country road. But now neither of us was sure that it was the Steinbeck airfield and not any other. At any rate, our ward was not on it. We decided to fly north to the canal. Lee, too, could get lost there in the fog and become an easy prey for German fighters. However, we did not fly together to the Finov Canal. Lubetsky's engine malfunctioned. Admittedly, I envied him. Now all responsibility fell on me. He turned back to land at Steinbeck Airfield. With the darkest thoughts, I continued my search. Alone now. After passing Bad Freinwalde and Oderberg, I went deep along the Oder almost to Schwedt, and, having safely avoided meeting with two Messerschmitts that had passed a few hundred metres above me, I set a course for Eberswald. What happened to Lee too? Weary of anxiety, I searched for the airplane in the air and on the ground, but he, as in water, vanished. In front of Eberswald, I saw that from the airfield in the air went up 3 links of fascist airplanes. I still can't understand why they didn't notice me. I was so desperate at that time that I almost threw myself at them in order, as they say, to sell my life dearly, once and for all to end the anxiety that tormented me. But I resisted the temptation and went over the canal at a glancing flight, dodging the fire of German anti-aircraft guns. I, like a hound, once again searched the whole area all the way to the Oder. With faint hope that I would catch Lee too in Barnówko, I set a course for the airfield, but even this hope was extinguished. Yesterday our base was empty and almost deserted. Only the guards remained on it. Obviously, our airplanes had already all left for Steinbeck. I was so discouraged that I almost forgot to release the landing gear. I didn't want to crash the airplane. But I realized in time and landed normally. I asked if Lee too had shown up after our flight. No, he didn't. Now I had given up hope completely. While I was refueling the plane, I looked at the map again on the route of our flight and made sure that Lubetsky was not mistaken about the location of Steinbeck, but I was not at all delighted. There was no Lidoire there. I flew to the new airfield feeling as if I were in a hurry to attend my own funeral. After passing the Oder, 2 railroads and a forest, I saw the airfield again. All the yaks were already parked. Behind them the ground attack planes were darkening in an uneven line, and at the very end of them the unfortunate Lee too. I was in a great hurry to land. Hope struggled in me with doubt and uncertainty. What if it was the wrong one? But it was the right one, inserted Lieutenant Chovnitsky. And in general, the case was simple and clear as clear as God's day, someone interrupted. You just have to always think with your head, brother. Technology, like math, loves numbers. You have to know how to count, said O'Brien. Podgorski shook his head. Yes, you have to know how to count, he agreed with a smile. Our speed was twice as great as Lee two's, and in addition, Lee two's pilot did wander a little in the fog and arrived at Steinbeck a few minutes after Lubetsky. Anyway, he went without cover, and the first Messerschmitt could shoot him at point-blank range. That's why our commander punished me very severely. He suspended me from combat sorties for 3 days. Actually, 3 days is nothing, but to hang around at the airfield for 3 days when others were flying was a terrible lot. I remember that the regiment made 101 sorties during that time. And me? He sighed heavily. There was silence. I looked at the faces of the pilots in search of a new victim. Looking at Captain Cromer, I remembered that the day before, talking to me, he mentioned a hole in the wing, received during a reconnaissance over the northern part of Berlin. No doubt he had been in grave danger then. He saw the flash, the flames of the rupture, and pieces of the left plane skin falling off. The airplane was thrown upward. The blast wave knocked the machine off course, and it tilted sharply to the left, toward the wing crippled by the explosion. The captain levelled the plane with the help of ailerons and, calculating that at high speed he would still be able to keep the yak from involuntary roll for some time, turned toward the airfield. Despite the fact that the engine was running at full speed, Cromie managed to squeeze out of the damaged yak only 300 kilometers per hour, and before Barnówko was about 100 kilometers. Already halfway there, his hands went numb from inhuman strain. The captain wanted to land on the first available field to get rid of the crampy muscle tension, but he knew that this would finally jeopardize the yak. So, clenching his teeth, he flew onward all the way to the Oder, driven by the fire of enemy anti-aircraft guns. Finally, even from afar, Cromie saw a familiar forest, among which hid Barnówko. With great difficulty went against the wind and tried to remove the gas, but because of the swirls in a large hole in the left plane, the plane almost snapped into a corkscrew, and the pilot was forced to increase the speed again and 2 more times to come in for a landing until he finally landed. Captain Cromer told me then that he still does not understand by what miracle he managed to land. It's not hard to imagine what he went through before he climbed out of the cockpit completely exhausted. I looked at him and wondered if this incident had been the most difficult ordeal for him at the front. As if reading my thoughts, he shook his head and said, "You know, that traffic jam I received over Berlin was really a big nuisance. Even today, remembering it, I still feel a cramp in my hands. But only, it seems to me, the worst thing I had to endure happened under Nauen." 2 of us, and Kalinowski, were returning from a reconnaissance over the Grand Canal at that time. We had been over Rathenau on the Havel River. This is about 170 kilometers from Barnówko. Therefore, after completing the mission, we had to land already at a new airfield near Steinbeck, much closer to Berlin. The anti-aircraft artillery near Rathenau met us with quite successful salvos. The shells went almost a kilometer away. We marked on the map the barges and ships in the harbour and on the canal, and turned east. Nauen, a large railroad junction, is also located on this canal, 40 kilometres from Rathenau and northwest of Berlin. As you know yourself, at that time the Nazis were very tightly blocking the airspace over their territory with patrols. And there, above Nauen, out of the clouds, we suddenly fell on us 12 Messerschmitts and immediately went on the attack. Kalinowski noticed them and immediately rushed up. I heard him throw to me over the radio, "Go into the clouds." At the same minute I spotted the first 4 Messerschmitts. I somehow managed to duck under them, but it was all in vain. The second 4 came down on me from above and, like it or not, I alone had to take the fight. At first I thought that now I was finished, but immediately I told myself that if I did not get rid of such thoughts, I would perish. I pulled myself together and decided to fight. I must confess that it was a very difficult decision to make. I was being pecked at from all sides by Messerschmitts, and only when one of them got on the sight, I suddenly decided that I would get out of here. I would get out by all means, and maybe even shoot down at least one fascist. But this invigorating thought soon left me. Only I pressed the throttles as one of the fascist planes hung on my tail, and the second from the side began to hold the hull of my yacht, and I shrank back, trying to turn into a lump, although I knew perfectly well that it would not help. Luckily for me, they all wanted to finish me off, so they all rushed at me and only hindered each other. They all rushed down after me as I went into a steep dive, and then suddenly candled upward and disappeared into the clouds. If just one of them had stayed up there and waited for me, I wouldn't have had to talk to you today. I can imagine how pissed off they were. I felt safe and breathed a sigh of relief. Then I popped up out of the clouds like a cork out of water, and I saw 4 Messerschmitts. I was spurred on as if by a whip. Instinctively I pressed the throttles, gave a short line to the planes, and without waiting for a response, again dived into the saving clouds. There I gradually came to my senses, but no longer felt the same confidence. Now the Germans were guarding me from above and below. I decided to stay in the clouds as long as possible and fly eastward by instruments. But when I looked at the instruments, I saw that the roll indicator did not work. The ball was frozen in the left extreme corner of the scale, not reacting at all to sharp movements of the rudder. In a minute I was no longer oriented. It seemed to me that I was sliding to the right wing, so I was sliding to the left, going off course. Eventually I dropped out of the clouds and again saw an even row of 4 Messerschmitts. Before they opened fire on me, I managed to hide again in the clouds, but the remnants of self-control left me now completely. I made 2 more attempts to get away from the Nazis, but each time I found them on the side or behind. 2 4s were waiting for me just below the clouds. The third was evidently scouring even the clouds to smoke me out of there, or was above. I could not fly blind for longer than a minute, and each time I made more and more mistakes in estimating the position of the airplane. Anxiety gripped me, and to hide it, a sticky fear crept up my back, wet with sweat. My head was splitting, my temples were pounding, and pain like thin needles penetrated my brain. Before leaving the clouds in me, awakened hope that the Messerschmitts are no longer there, and every time I was horrified to see that they were coming straight at me. So I slowly but persistently advanced to the east, and the Nazis guarded me, ready to attack and confident that I still will not escape them. I also knew that sooner or later they would intercept me. I was running out of fuel, and they definitely had more. So I went to the extreme. I entered the clouds, turned 180 degrees, and headed west, trying to keep that direction as long as possible. It was a desperate attempt. I was getting farther away from the airfield and from the front line. In a forced landing, I would surely have been captured. But this was my last, albeit small, chance of rescue. I flew in the clouds, seeing nothing and not reacting to the deceptive rolls of the machine, and only kept looking at the compass and speed indicator. I flew for a minute, 2, 4. It seemed to me that I was going to the ground, but the speed did not increase at all. At last I ventured once more to make my way down. The absorbent cotton turned white, dissipated, and was left behind, and instead the ground beneath me darkened. I looked around. I had no idea where I was. I tried to orient myself on the map, but I had to abandon it. My attention was too absorbed in watching to avoid being caught by surprise by enemy fighters. I headed northeast, then east, and in half an hour I saw the Oder. I landed without a drop of gasoline at one of the Soviet airfields where I was refueled. In the evening flew to Steinbeck. I was in time to take part in the wake arranged for me by my comrades. I was buried by Kalinowski. He saw me dive all the way to the ground. He thought it was the end, especially since at that moment he himself got into a fight above the clouds and barely escaped from one particularly annoying fighter who chased him all the way to the Oder. With these words, Cromie finished his story. After a moment's silence, the captain turned to me and said decisively, "Well, for today it seems that's enough." We sat in the bright, cosy apartment of Colonel Vikerkevich. We recollected about long past but memorable days, about victories and defeats, about adventures on the ground and in the air, about escapes from captivity. Memories flowed casually until I called the name of a man who had long interested me, who personified for all present the ideal of a commander, the name of Lieutenant Colonel Taldekin, and immediately the room became quiet and silent. These people, sitting in the room, who had come at the first call from all parts of the Soviet Union to Ryazan to create a Polish aviation regiment and fight the fascist invaders, people who had learned in the difficult conditions of the harsh military situation that the shortest way to return to their homeland was to fight together with the Soviet army, people who had learned the joy of victory in battles with the enemy, fighting with him over Warsaw and Kołobrzeg, over the Oder and Berlin. These people were silent. A moment ago, remembering their first steps in aviation, they were teasing each other, with purely soldierly humour, sometimes quite salty, laughed at their then helplessness in moments of serious danger, casually talked about unusual luck, about the coolness with which they avoided death, about the most dangerous fights and flights. And now they were all suddenly silent at the mere mention of that name. I thought I had done something indelicate, and I did not know how to get out of this awkward position. Meanwhile, the silence grew more and more tense. I waited for one of them to help me out of this impasse, but no one broke the silence. I was seized with a kind of incomprehensible fear. It seemed to me that the silence was about to burst and fall upon me with the deafening roar of engines, the thunder of all the guns that had ever fired in this war. But nothing happened. Colonel Vikerkiewicz just said, "Pour us some of ours, the fighters." These words, addressed to Lieutenant Podgorski, diffused the situation. Quite restrained at my inquiries about their own experiences and adventures, the pilots, remembering their former commander, started talking all at once. From their chaotic statements I learned what kind of man Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Taldeikin was. I realized that he had taken undivided possession of their hearts, took possession as only a man with a firm character and great strength of conviction can do. He was a clever man, and his innate kindness was perfectly matched with the determination and talent of a commander, fair and sensitive. He could not stand sycophants. He was exacting. Sometimes even demanded from his subordinates self-sacrifice in the performance of particularly important combat missions. When it was necessary, the first without hesitation went to the danger. He acted soberly, without excessive bravado, always fulfilling one commandment, not to throw the lives of those who called him Batka among themselves. He knew the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. He punished the wrongdoer in his own way. He suspended him from combat missions for a few days. He knew that such punishment was very hard for a real pilot, because he was a real pilot himself. For the enemy, he was a formidable opponent, on his account of 8 downed enemy aircraft. Taldeikin very much wanted his regiment to be the best. Russian by nationality and a citizen of the USSR, he strove with all his soul to ensure that the Polish pilots earned the glory of the most fighting crews. He was nicknamed Batka because he protected the young, inexperienced pilots until they mastered the combat situation and gained the necessary experience from their senior comrades. Now they, worriedly, remembered their commander. From them I learned the details of the death of the former commander of the regiment, Warsaw. It happened on March 16, 1945. Part of the regiment had already moved to the airfield near Debrecen. The rest, less experienced crews, were still in Bydgoszcz. At the airfield, talkative rivulets flowed from under the settling snowdrifts, gathering into huge puddles in which the frowning sky was reflected. The ground had already thawed. The wheels of cars slammed into the ground, forming deep ruts. Night and morning frosts covered the surface of the airfield with a crisp crust of ice, but by noon everything thawed again, and the mud spurted out from under the wheels of airplanes as black geysers. At the slightest braking, the cars were sharply skidding sideways. Under gusts of north wind, the fog sometimes dissipated, but immediately thickened again, and when the wind subsided, dropped very low, and then visibility is completely lost. Despite this, Lieutenant Colonel Taldeikin arrived early in the morning from Bydgoszcz to personally supervise the flights. It was reported that near Kolobrzeg Hitlerites landed reinforcements. There was stubbornly defending a large group of troops, which from the sea supported by ships, and from the air, aircraft. At 9 o'clock in the morning, despite the disappointing weather report, an attempt was made to take off. But the fog was so thick that visibility was reduced to 50 meters, and the flight had to be postponed. It began to drizzle. Before noon, on-duty crews 3 times announced and 3 times cancelled the alarm. Finally, the regiment commander sent Captain Baev to scout the weather. Baev taxied to the edge of the airfield, took off, and a few seconds later his yak disappeared in an impenetrable thick fog. It seemed that the plane was drowned in it, but a minute later from the direction of the city heard the murmur of the engine. It intensified and grew until it became a roar over the airfield, and then quieted down again, moving away towards Polchin. Meanwhile, the crews on duty were allowed to have lunch. They all ate together, listening every minute to see if Baev was flying. It stopped raining, and a fresh breeze drove more and more waves of thick fog. Suddenly a faint sound began to grow from afar, But no, it was not an airplane. A liaison on a motorcycle at breakneck speed rushed along the wet and slippery highway in a hurry to deliver a combat order of the division commander. Taldekin pushed his plate away, opened the package, and read the order aloud. The enemy is landing near Kolobrazeg. Under cover of fighters, send out attack aircraft and destroy the landing force. Lieutenant Colonel looked around at all present and met their wary eyes. To fly in such a fog. Major Lisetsky, fly with me, quickly said Taldekin, and, shoving the order into his pocket, went back to eating. Lisetsky had already finished his lunch and had a cigarette. He thought he heard the engine murmur again. He went to the window and looked at the sky. The clouds overhung the airfield with an impenetrable grey mass. A thick fog enveloped the airfield. From somewhere far away came a low bass buzzing, which grew stronger with every second, became higher, and finally changed into a baritone, from which the window panes rang softly. "Baev is coming back," said the major. The airplane was not visible, but the air shook with a loud murmur that dissolved into a space full of fog and soft silence. Flying low along the railroad bed, the plane drew nearer, glimpsing in a thick featherbed of clouds. At last, at the very edge of the airfield, it broke out of them. A vague shadow skipped sideways, made a U-turn and immediately disappeared to come in a minute to land. And now, throwing in both directions thick splashes of water and mud, the machine jumped on the ground. Captain Baev carefully approached the parking place and turned off the engine. The mechanic helped the pilot to get out of the cockpit and unbuckle the parachute. At that time, Lieutenant Colonel Taldekin appeared on the walkway. He took quick steps toward Baev, shouted from afar, "Well?" Baev went to meet him. "Here we have perhaps the worst, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel," he said, gloomily looking at the sky. "But beyond the lakes we can endure, although the clouds are everywhere low, only 200 meters. "And further on how?" Taldekin asked. "Further differently, where it is better, where it is worse. But it seems to me that in general the weather is improving." Lieutenant Colonel looked at his watch. It was 20 minutes past 3. "Let's take off," he said firmly. "Notify the attacking planes." Like a flock of black monstrous fish in the murky standing water swam above the ground-close formation of hump-backed Elos. Here they came out from behind the forest, drawn by slices into equal rectangles, and went over the lakes, along which there were ribbons of asphalted roads, in some places thrown over viaducts, over railroad lines. The clouds gradually lifted, and once even sunlight timidly tried to break through their monolithic layer. Visibility improved. Taldekin, who kept to the right of the stormtroopers, climbed higher, and Lisetsky gradually climbed to the left, until he encountered a new cloud layer, forcing him to align with the silt. And from that moment visibility began to deteriorate sharply again. The lower boundary of the clouds lowered. The airplanes were in the clouds, and the pilots, having reduced speed, tightened their formation in order not to lose each other. Straight ahead, toward Polchin, the clouds swirled over the ground, and on the left they crept over the forests and densely filled the forest clearings with thick, impenetrable milk of fog. Only behind the formation was there still a narrow grey gap. It was reckless to break through further, and Taldekin obeyed without objection the decision of the leading Ilov, made a U-turn over the highway, barely distinguishable between the first houses on the outskirts of Polchin. As he was turning, Lisetsky noticed the lancet tower of a church glimmering in the fog under the wing and began to look down with intensity. He almost instinctively guessed the terrain by faintly visible details, which from time to time appeared in front of him and immediately disappeared in the milky shroud of fog. He glanced at his compass to make sure he was on the right course, then looked back to count the attacking planes. They were coming in close, wing to wing. Behind them, just behind and below, receding, flew Taldekin. Meanwhile, the cloud-free corridor stretched and narrowed even further. This murky opening, almost indistinguishable from the grey fog surrounding the formation, blurred and at last impenetrable darkness enveloped them on all sides. At the same second, Major Lisetsky heard Taldikin's voice in his earphones and looked back. "Where are you?" the lieutenant colonel asked. "Do you see me?" Lisetsky answered in the affirmative, and noticing that the commander is no longer away from the formation and even ahead of him, added, "You are flying correctly. I go to the left and a little below the stormtroopers." Taldikin mumbled something unintelligible. Lisetsky took it as a strong word for the weather, and only when Yak, lieutenant colonel, entered the left turn and began to go under the attack aircraft, he realized that the commander does not see them and does not even assume that they are flying immediately behind him and above. Lisetsky wanted to warn him, but he didn't have time. Taldikin turned steeper, and their cars almost collided. In the last fraction of a second, Taldikin noticed it and sped up. That's what killed him. Saving the major, he lost speed. The plane sharply raised its nose, wagged its tail, and flipped over the wing, snapped into a corkscrew. Taldikin, an experienced pilot, probably immediately realized the mortal danger looming over him. To level the airplane it was necessary to gain speed, but the distance to the ground was too small, only about 100 meters, too little to accelerate the machine. Still, Lieutenant Colonel somehow managed to bring the falling plane between a high railway embankment and some earth berm, where it was still possible to win a few meters needed to level the machine. But, alas, it was already too late. The propeller stripped on the ground, ripped out clods of soil, the engine broke off the frame and buried in the ground, the wings flew off to the side, and the fuselage cracked and turned over on its back. The pilot ejected from the cockpit was found a few dozen meters from where the plane went down. Sunday afternoon we gathered in the buffet of the military canteen. Beer, good Polish beer, was foaming in thick glass mugs. The room was semi-dark, a pleasant coolness surrounding us. Cigarette lights flickered here and there. Voices came from unknown places, and it was not immediately possible to guess which of those present uttered this or that phrase. "My instructor was Lieutenant Gavrilov," said Lieutenant Lazar, a short blonde man with an open, broad peasant's face and a soft look in his good-natured eyes. "He was nervous, God forbid. I remember how he taught me how to do a flip, but instead of a flip, every time I put the car into a corkscrew, he tried so hard, but I couldn't do it. Every time we landed, he'd sit in the cockpit and cry. 'I swear,' he cried, probably out of anger. He was a very brave pilot. He flew beautifully, but he died during a demonstration battle over the airfield. The pilot, whom he was to attack, flew very low to him, and Gavrilov was in a hurry and did not want to wait for him to make a second approach. He attacked him, pulled back with a flip and attacked again. But this time Gavrilov was already too low and, not having time to level the machine, crashed into the ground. It happened, I think, in the spring of the 44th year, asked someone from the other end of the table. In April, Lazar confirmed. Gavrilov always told me that to attack the enemy in the air is much easier than skillfully get out of the battle, when the enemy is in a more favourable position. And he believed that the best way out of such a position was a coup de grace at the right moment. A brief professional argument erupted, after which Lazar said, "It always seems to the uninitiated that if it comes to air combat, one of the opponents is bound to perish, or at best ejected with a parachute from a hit car," inserted Lieutenant Podgorski. "But fortunately the devil is not as bad as they make it out to be," said Captain Cromie. "Most fights usually end with a few trifling holes in the wings or fuselage. As for the uninitiated, they just don't have the brains to get it right. You try to tell about some heavy combat to someone who doesn't know a damn thing about it. I'm talking about such a battle, from which the pilot came out unharmed and unscathed, without shooting down a single enemy aircraft, or try to tell about a lightning fight that lasts only a few seconds and ends with no result. Your uninitiated probably won't understand a damn thing, and you won't be able to impress him. He will simply not believe that such a lightning fight is no less formidable and dangerous than the battle of many squadrons. Such a fight will seem to him a trifle and not worthy of attention. And why is that? Because such people believe that the measure of bravery, coolness, and other high-minded notions, the essence of which such a person will never comprehend, can only be a battle that ends with at least one downed aircraft. But in reality, sometimes the way out of a fruitless battle is much harder and requires more equanimity than a spectacular victory, which is sometimes given simply by chance. That's why Gavrilov, in my opinion, was right when he said that it is immeasurably harder and more honourable to come out of a heavy battle with a survivor than to shoot down the enemy. And at Lisetsky, and at Baev, and at Schwarz, everyone has on the account of shot-down aircraft, and all three of them had more than one air battle. But I vouch that none of them considers the most difficult battle in which he managed to shoot down an airplane. We've all had fights that ended inconclusively. They may seem ineffective, but we are all satisfied that we came out of those fights unscathed, but only just. Obviously you have no reason to write about it, he said to me. After all, in these battles for the reader will be missing the main thing, the apt line, striking the enemy. I felt the familiar piercing gaze of the captain, and though I knew that in the darkness he could not see me, it seemed to me as if his gaze was reading my thoughts and studying them, waiting to see what I would say. Of course, he was right about many things. It is indeed difficult, without repeating oneself, to recount all these fruitless struggles. It is quite natural that any author will immediately choose the most spectacular case from the available material without going into details. Perhaps the accuracy of the fact described will suffer from this, but it will win its colourfulness. If I had to create a documentary story, I would obviously describe everything sequentially, all sorties, all battles, everything that these pilots have done. At that time, in a conversation over a mug of beer, I had no idea what I would be able to construct out of all the chaotic facts that fell on me. And I perceived Captain Cromer's remarks and piercing glances as incomprehensible reproaches against me, to which I could not object. But the captain himself took me out of the difficulty. It seems to me that in order to write something, you should certainly collect as much material as possible, he said. I told him that I was interested in each of their battles and immediately asked Lieutenant Lazar to continue my story. I just wanted to tell you about one heavy battle, which we conducted together with Lieutenant Bobrovsky, began Lazar. It happened in the second half of April, when the regiment stood in Barnuvko. We flew out to reconnoitre the area of Schwedt, Angermünde, Joachimsthal. We had to photograph the airfield at Eberswalde and to find out the situation on the Fino Canal down to the Havel River. We had no doubt that enemy fighters would try to interfere with us, especially since the weather was good and only a light haze hung in the air. We approached Eberswalde from the northwest. We flew at an altitude of 1,500 metres, navigating by the lakes stretching from Angermünde to the Finn Canal. Lieutenant Bobrovsky made a survey, passing from north to south directly over the airfield. Then we turned around, and immediately I noticed 6 airplanes slightly below us. I was not able to recognize them at once. It took at least a minute before I was convinced that they were Focke-Wulfs. In the meantime, Bobrovsky had managed to turn to the right to the canal and significantly distanced himself from me. I looked for him with my eyes and saw that he was at least a kilometre away and that he was surrounded by 6 Krauts. One of them was already preparing to fire on Bobrovsky, coming in his tail. I did not have time to come to his aid. Among the clouds, in the soft scattered sunlight, I saw a Focke-Wulf right above me. A second and a third flew by, and when I looked up I saw that I was surrounded by 6 of them. Now we were cut off from each other. I still had time to notice how Bobrovsky made a rapid turn with a gain in altitude and disappeared into the clouds. I had to take care of myself, and then I remembered Gavrilov's advice to escape by turning. Aiming at the nearest Focke-Wulf, I gave it a line, immediately made a turn and threw his yak in a steep dive. Nobody shot at me, probably lost sight of me. I levelled the machine almost over the canal. Taking a course to the west, flew to Havel, then turned to the east. There were no enemy planes in sight, and I was completely calm. And only when I was flying over Eberswalde, I noticed some machine. It was obviously following me. Just to be on the safe side, I climbed higher, but did not increase my speed. Perhaps, I thought, I was being chased by Lieutenant Bobrovsky. Now I had to distribute my attention between the plane that was catching up with me and the enemy's anti-aircraft guns, and in addition I had to watch the traffic along the canal and on its banks. The narrow strip of the canal now and then branched off, forming in the middle a number of islets connected by bridges. Having broken through the barrage of anti-aircraft fire at Oderberg, I looked back again. The plane that had caught up with me was already close, but I could not recognize it yet. It was coming from the direction of the sun. Directly in front of me, 15 kilometers away, I could see the Oder. I asked the plane that was catching up with me on the radio who was flying. There was no answer. I thought that Bobrovsky's radio had probably failed. I reduced my speed. And suddenly he gave me a long line from all his guns and machine guns. The shells flew only a meter away from my yak. I almost tore off the throttle lever and the car went flying. The Nazi plane was very close and almost hung on my tail. I could not risk to make a turn because of the low speed. I remembered the case with Gavrilov. Having no freedom of manoeuvre, I could not fight on the verticals, because the Hitlerovite would have blown me to pieces if I had thought for a second to put his belly or the back of my yak. The only thing that could still save me was a small turn and a high speed on a strafing flight over the ground. How I was scrambling then! Trees, houses, hills were flying towards me at breakneck speed, suddenly growing right in front of me. I soared upward, swept over them, and immediately pressed myself almost close to the ground. Having jumped out to the Oder, I turned sharply to the right, upstream, and only there finally got rid of the pursuer, who either lost me or simply turned back. I have no particular reason to be proud of that escape, added Lieutenant Lazar after a moment, but I do not reproach myself for it. We accomplished the mission. Bobrovsky delivered good pictures, and I delivered the information that our command needed. In addition, we did not allow ourselves to shoot down 13 and possibly 19 enemy planes that were hunting for us. Isn't that enough? I think it's enough, I answered without hesitation. And every one of us thinks so? Captain Cromer muttered under his breath. Everyone who has experienced it, or who has even the slightest idea of it. Well, as for the readers then, yes, for example, Chovnitsky or Baiv, and over Eberswalde, and over Vritzen, and over the Havel River. In every flight they had to fight with Focke-Wulfs, but alas, they did not shoot down a single one. They will probably tell you about these battles themselves. After all, you realize what it cost them. But it's not good for a spectacular subject. I looked in the direction where Lieutenant Chovnitsky was sitting. He did not smoke, and so in the darkness I could not distinguish his pleasant, intelligent face, and only against the background of the light rectangle of the window I could see the clear silhouette of his shouldered figure. Even now he expressed no desire to take part in the conversation and remained silent. But then I remembered that the joint flights with Chovnitsky told me about Captain Baiv. He spoke to me as if he was flipping through the pages of combat reports in his memoirs about all the missions that they performed together with Chovnitsky. Here are a few of his short stories. The raid of 300 planes on Vritzen on April 16, 1945. There were 12 of us from the Warsaw Regiment. I flew with Chovnitsky. All the time we had to be on the lookout. There were at least 120 Focke-Wulfs around us, which attacked us time and time again. From this flight we both returned completely exhausted. That same day, in the next flight, I shot down one Nazi airplane. The patrol flight of Baiv and Chovnitsky, which lasted for an hour, in the area of Eberswalde on April 24, 1945. When we were returning to the airfield, we were attacked by 4 Focke-Wulfs. Fuel was running low. We could not engage them, and so we only gave them a short line. There were 4 of them, 2 of us. We could not get away from them. Focke-Wulfs cut off our way to the airfield, and as a result we ended up over Berlin. Not only that, Focke-Wulfs hung on our tail. Anti-aircraft guns from the ground also gave us heat. Only near Frankfurt the Lamas managed to break away from the Nazi planes, and we reached our airfield literally on the last drops of gasoline. We had a hell of a time. Reconnaissance over Berlin with Chovnitsky on April 27, 1945. There was so much smoke in the air that we couldn't breathe. We had to fly away from the city every 5 minutes to get a breath of fresh air. The smoke was so thick that at a few meters you could not see anything, and we had to play hide-and-seek with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. They now and then jumped out of the clouds of smoke and gave us a line. From the rear, from the sides, from above, from below, we repulsed their unexpected attacks or attacked ourselves. Maybe this aerial reconnaissance over the Berlin scorcher and was not so dangerous, but personally I was completely exhausted by it. So sparingly, mundanely, as if it was a walk in the mountains or a game of bridge, told Mibaev about his combat missions. It is not surprising, therefore, that from such a brief story, the reader, of course, will not be able to imagine what nervous tension pilots experienced in these flights. All this must be experienced by yourself. Captain Kuromi, quite long, and, as always, stared intently at the Lieutenant Chovnitsky, but he seemed not to notice it. He sat as if pondering whether to tell about what seemed to be troubling him during the continuation of our conversation, and at last he said, "I think we're talking about the wrong thing." "What do you mean wrong?" someone in the dark asked. "What does spectacularity have to do with it? What does it have to do with the outcome of the battle? Take, for example, the case of Gosyominsky. Judge for yourself." He turned to me. "Spectacular it or not." And then I listened to another episode, which I quote here almost verbatim, without embellishing anything. It seems to me that I had to put it in this book, if only because it tells about the death of one of those who, with their blood and life, created a short but heroic combat history of the regiment Warsaw. On that day, Captain Barjev was leading a fighter wing flying from Bydgoszcz to reconnoitre the Chojnice, Szczecinek area. Barjev flew in a pair with Bobrowski. The second pair consisted of Lieutenant Gabis and Lieutenant Gosyominsky. On February 13th, the weather was overcast, cloud height, 800 metres, snow at times. It is not known for what reason Gosyominsky lagged behind his leader for a good 400 metres before Chojnice and did not answer his calls. Probably his walkie-talkie failed. Suddenly, 2 Messerschmitts emerged from the clouds and began to tail Gosyominsky. In all probability, he did not see them. But they were noticed by Bobrowski, who looked back when he heard Gabis calling his partner in Vine. Bobrowski immediately warned Gosyominsky about the danger on the radio, but in Vine, Gabis's voice was heard by everyone except the one who was threatened by it. Gabis turned 180 degrees, gained altitude, and saw the lagging Yak already carried in a deadly dive to the ground. He was pursued by a Messerschmitt, which then soared up and disappeared into the clouds. Meanwhile, the second Messerschmitt, noticing the new enemy, opened fire on him. Gabis responded in the same way and got into a short, fierce battle from which the Hitlerovets came out as soon as he reached the clouds. For almost a minute, Gabis stalked him and then dropped over the remains of the dead Gosyominsky, said goodbye to him, and flew to catch up with the first pair. So much for the air battle in which the airplane was shot down. But is it a battle? Said Chovnitsky, waving his hands. Gosyominsky did not even know that he was dying. Maybe he was hit by the first line, and he died before he hit the ground. There was silence. Probably each of them thought that he himself might have died in the same way. Late that night, on my way home, I thought of all the ineffective flights that the Warsaw pilots had told me about. All of them would not fit into this book, although each of them was a speck of the regiment's combat history, and each left an indelible mark in someone's memory. Never before or after I had such a commander, said Major Lisetsky, having finished his story about the death of Lieutenant Colonel Taldykin. Colonel Wihakiewicz, the current commander of the regiment Warsaw, this did not offend in the slightest. On the contrary, he was the first to confirm that Taldykin was indeed an exceptional commander. Everyone agreed with him. And Engineer Captain Shurko added that the regiment was lucky to have good commanders. And Major Gashin was a great guy too, he said. Everyone agreed with Shirko. Gashin also left a good memory of himself in the regiment, although he flew a little and commanded quite differently than Batka Taldikin. He really trusted us, said Lisetsky. By that time, squadron and wing commanders had already gained sufficient combat experience and could command in the air independently. Sometimes he tried to pretend to be a formidable, menacing, well, how can I put it? Menacing uncle, inserted Chovnitsky. Every time before the flight he thundered and thundered, warned that if the Lynx do not fulfill the task 100%, then let them better not return, or he will give them such. But none of us, and obviously he himself, did not know what lay behind this threat. And in reality, Gashin was a patient man, and never scolded anyone without reason. Sending us on a mission, he was very worried about us, but tried to hide it, which he, however, very rarely succeeded. Remember how Major Lisetsky did not return from a flight over Berlin? Gashin was so depressed about it that he literally could not find a place. Later he claimed that he had a premonition that I would return. The Major smiled. Well, I did come back, only with such bruises and bumps as if I'd been ground on peas. I was sure I wouldn't make it, if it hadn't been for that haystack. You must tell me all about it, from the beginning, I said firmly. The Major looked at me with a sly smile. In the merry look of his black eyes there were mischievous sparks. He began to talk. I listened to him with pleasure. He spoke with imagination and vividness. His swarthy face was covered with a light blush. Well-built, slightly stocky figure was in incessant motion. It seemed that the seething temperament of this man boiled and overflowed over the edge, not allowing him to sit still. We had to cover the crossing at the Rupina Canal near Kremen, said Lisetsky. It was at the end of April, I think on the 30th. We flew 4 Yak-9 airplanes. The machines are wonderful. In the first pair flew me and Kremper, and in the second Golubitsky and Sushek. We in a hurry even forgot to have breakfast. Major Gashin called us to him about 5 in the morning. When we reported to him about our arrival, he said in a menacing tone that if the Germans will break the crossing, it is better for us not to show our faces to him at all. With this admonition, we took off at dawn from Leuenberg airfield. The cloud cover was low and visibility was limited. The wind was blowing from the southeast, from the direction of burning Berlin. There was a veil of smoke and soot in the air, which was very annoying for us during the flight. No sooner had we reached Oranienburg than the engines of the second pair started to malfunction. Both planes turned back, and Kremper and I flew to the crossing to save the honour of our regiment. From the ground we were informed by radio that we are trying to surround us, Focke-Wulfs. In reality, no one surrounded us. Only 2 enemy fighters appeared from the side of Berlin, and they immediately turned back, not getting involved in the fight with us. Hungry and angry, we continued to circle over the crossing. With each circle the mood worsened. Time was running out, fuel was running out, and the shift was still missing. Of course, you know what you usually do on such missions. You wring your neck, looking for the enemy from all sides. And this enemy is not so stupid as to climb on 2 poles, hungry and angry as devils. Down below you, like ants, columns of troops are crawling. They move slowly across the bridge. The sappers, like water beetles, scurry back and forth across the water in their boats. And the artillery is pounding the shore. After an hour you start to feel queasy, and there's still no shift. You even start to hallucinate. Your nerves get all frayed. "Do you have hallucinations?" I asked in surprise. He laughed and gave me a sly wink. Then I did. A huge cup of coffee would appear in front of me alternately, or a bun like this. He spread his arms wide apart. Buttered, or a can of canned meat opened. "No, it was crazy," exclaimed the Major, leaning back in his chair. "When I dreamed it all for the 3rd time, I couldn't stand it any longer. Called grass, and said, 'I have 99. These last words of Lisiecki's stunned me. The thought flashed through my mind that this cheerful, healthy-looking man, who had summoned weed and had 99 after all these hallucinations, was obviously not well with his head. But it turned out that grass were the call signs of the ground radio station, and 99 was just a conditional code, which meant there was only fuel left to return to the airfield. There was no reply for a long time, continued the Major, but at last I heard, 48, that is, you can return. Well, I think, thank God. In the meantime, the wind had changed and brought clouds from the north. They were already raining over the valley of the Havel River and slowly crept towards Berlin. I decided to bypass the clouds from the south and, flying over Berlin, to go between Bernau and Blumberg, and from there along the railroad tracks to get to the airfield. Over Berlin we could be met by enemy planes. To cover me in time, Kremper, just in case, flew behind me a little higher. In moments of danger he never lost his head, so I felt calm. We were sometimes shot at from the ground, but not particularly well. But we were forced to take the shortest route. We were running out of fuel. The suburbs of Berlin were on fire. There was so much smoke in the air that my throat was unbearably scratchy. Behind the grey veil, I couldn't even see the houses. The smoke drifted over the city, rising and falling lazily in undulating streaks. And only the flashes of anti-aircraft batteries and the red flames of the fires sometimes broke through this dense veil, something like the flickering flame of a candle, if you look at it through smoked glass. I looked impatiently into the space free from this veil, which began beyond the Ring Highway, between its two branches, at Eberswalde and at Kostersinn. The smoke seemed to have cleared away somewhat in this direction. I could see some railroad tracks and even trees. Again the anti-aircraft guns began to hit us. Suddenly one of the shells exploded almost near the engine. The car shook. It seemed to crouch and went off course, as if running into an invisible barrier that was in its way. I was thrown into a fever. The shell exploded very close, and that always gets on my nerves. To get out of the firing zone, I gave the handle away from me and to the left, but immediately I felt a sharp jolt. I thought, even, I think, shouted loudly, "Hit!" and, machine holding the airplane with rudders, waited in suspense for what would happen next. It lasted no more than 2 or 3 seconds. In my head, as in a kaleidoscope, various pictures flashed through my mind. Here I was opening the lantern, unbuckling the straps, turning the yak on its back, falling out of the plane, opening the parachute. Being carried away, Lisetsky began to illustrate his supposed actions with gestures and suddenly jumped out of his chair. "And you, Sotar?" he said, stretching out his words. I confess I caught my breath. For a minute it seemed to me as if I was falling out of the airplane, clearly realizing that I would not be able to use the parachute. Lisetsky sat down again and said, "But I did not jump out. He did not jump out because it was really too late. And besides, he was over the territory occupied by the enemy. He decided to take his chances and try to make it to his own." Jak still obeyed the hand of the pilot. From the punctured tanks leaked out the remains of gasoline. Released halfway landing gear could not be neither retracted back nor released to the end. The pressure of fuel dropped sharply. The engine, to which the fuel supply was cut off, snorted and choked. Lisetsky thought that if the Nazis started firing at him again, Kremper would cover him with the fire of his machine guns. To reduce the chance of a fire possible during a forced landing, Lisetsky turned off the ignition, then shouted to Kremper over the radio, "I'm hit! I'm coming in for a landing!" and went down towards the ground. I saw the ground and... numb, Lisetsky continued. Straight in front of me looped lines of trenches. To the right, at the high railroad embankment, a half-station was burning. To the left stretched a row of 2-story houses, reaching almost to the embankment. True, one could still try to skip between these houses and the embankment and land on the ploughed strip, but this was prevented by a small pond in the middle of the marshy lawn, and on top of that, between the trenches and this pond, was a tall haystack. I immediately realized that it was absolutely impossible to land my car in this labyrinth. I realized that I would hardly get out of this mess in one piece, and maybe I would not even get out at all. However, I did not lose my presence of mind. Even on the contrary, with all my nervous tension, I soberly assessed the situation and, it seems, did not make a single mistake. I slid on the wing, flew over the trenches, levelled the car in time and flew very close to the windows of the house, which stood 15 metres from the railroad embankment. I was carried right onto this protruding haystack. Unfortunately, when I got close to the top of the haystack, the airplane's speed was not yet sufficiently reduced. Having hit the haystack with the left wing, the yak turned around. The wing fell to pieces, hit the ground with the end of the right wing. It immediately broke at the base, ploughed a deep furrow with the propeller and fell heavily on my back. I was shaking in the cabin like a splinter. Then, obviously, I bumped my head on something and lost consciousness. I came to my senses in an ambulance. An unfamiliar Russian doctor was taking me to the hospital. I couldn't speak at all. I was throwing up all the time. I clenched my teeth in pain. The car was rushing frantically over bumps and potholes. The stretcher was bouncing, and the covered body was cracking and seemed ready to collapse. Finally, the car pulled out onto a smooth highway. Here I was able to turn my head a little. I saw a young orderly. He frantically grasped the stretcher with both hands, trying to keep his balance. The orderly bent his sweaty face over me, covered with a thin, long unshaven stubble, and said, "It's gone." The car slowed down, and I felt a little better. I asked the orderly what had happened, because I didn't remember anything. "You were hit," he replied, looking me straight in the eye. "You fell in the strip of the 65th Army, about 200 metres from the trenches, but on our side. The soldiers pulled you out of the cockpit of the plane and then called us. We could not get closer. The fascists opened furious fire. How do you feel?" I tried to move my arms and legs. Then, leaning on the wall of the body, I lifted myself up and sat down. My whole body ached, and I felt a large lump on my forehead under the bandage. Everything else seemed to be intact. I finally remembered my landing and, I confess, I was surprised that I was alive. I was very thirsty. The orderly gave me some water. I asked him about the Kremlin. He flew west. First descended over your plane, circled, and then flew. I thought that Kremper had obviously long ago returned to the regiment, and that the comrades must have already had time to drink for the repose of my soul. And the crossing still survived. Lisetsky finished his story and smiled. Sub-Lieutenant Kremper, Lieutenant O'Brien and I walked slowly along the road around the airfield. O'Brien is no longer with the Warsaw Regiment, but he sometimes comes here to visit old comrades with whom he fought together and fought all the way from the airfield in Zadibastar to Motlov, the regiment's last frontline airfield. We walked at a leisurely pace, for O'Brien was still troubled by his wounded leg. He had been wounded in what he called a friendly misunderstanding. It happened in 1946, well after the war. The doctors promised to cure him soon, but for now, as soon as the young lieutenant notices the expression of admiration mixed with sympathy in the eyes of strange girls, he shrinks from embarrassment. "They probably think that I was wounded at the front," he turned to me, "and they see me as a hero. What a story. I don't know what the charming girls are thinking, looking at a young war veteran in a pilot's uniform with colourful ribbons on his chest. The girls certainly like O'Brien, though he doesn't seem to pay much attention to them. He is a rather tall, lean and well-built young man, with light, deep-set eyes and wavy blonde hair. His tanned face, with correct features and a somewhat cocky expression, always attracts attention. It's no surprise that girls look up to a guy like him. In 1941, O'Brien, a member of an underground group, was captured by the Gestapo, but he managed to escape. On May 13th, he crossed over near Sanok to the Soviet side. When in 1943 the 1st Polish Division, named after Tadeusz Kosciuszko, began to form near Ryazan, O'Brien arrived there and was enrolled in the 4th Squadron, where he was trained under instructor Nikonov. It is only a pity that compared to the 1st Squadrons we started flying rather late. So I flew my first combat mission only in December of the 44th year, recalled O'Brien. "And you?" I asked Lieutenant Krempu. "And me a few months later," he answered. "The first time I flew with Kalinowski on reconnaissance in the area of Vritzen, and we immediately had to fight with 4 Focke-Wulfs. Kremper and Kalinowski took to the air already in the evening. Visibility was pretty bad. Approximately halfway, behind the Oder, at an altitude of 800 metres, they were shrouded in smoke. Fires caused by artillery fire were blazing all around. Visibility further deteriorated and, probably, so Lieutenant Kremper did not notice the 4 Focke-Wulfs coming directly at him, which even from afar opened fire. Kalinowski let them get closer, then combat turned sword upward, leading a young partner, and went Focke-Wulfs in the tail. It happened so quickly that Kremper realized what was going on only when he had already levelled the car. Noticing the Focke-Wulfs, he, following the example of his leader, fell on one of them on top and pressed the throttle. Then he fired 3 consecutive long bursts at another Focke-Wulf. Kalinowski ordered him to cease fire. The enemy was going down. There was no time to pursue him. There was still an unfulfilled mission ahead. "We then collected very valuable data," said Kremper, "but in fact this flight was quite ordinary, and only to me it seemed extraordinary. The first time I fought with the enemy and the first time I was behind the front line, over Berlin." For some time we walked in silence. The shadows of clouds floated on the fresh green of the airfield. Larks were singing high in the sky. A warm southern breeze, frolicking, drove the first fluffy dandelion seeds across the fields. It was spring-like warm and calm, and we remembered our recent past, how the earth was smoking and burning under us in the hell of war. It lay black and charred, ploughed by tank tracks, torn by shells and abundantly soaked with the blood of people who gave their lives for our victory. We have survived. We live. Larks are singing, clouds are floating, wind is blowing, spring and peace are all around. At that moment, everything around me seemed surprisingly unusual. The fact that I was here, the fact that these 2 pilots were walking calmly beside me, and around us no shells were falling, and no rumble of battle could be heard, and also the fact that our words could not evoke from the past the storm that swept over the earth. Although each of our phrases revived in my memory the pictures of the experienced excitement, grief, and suffering of the war. I was brought out of my deep thoughtfulness by the voice of Lieutenant O'Brien. "Have you heard of this German yak?" I did not understand his question. Evidently one of them remembered some incident now, and I, thinking about it, had not heard it. I felt embarrassed and asked, "What yak are you talking about?" "It was never shot down," Kremper inserted and explained. "It was the yak which I met in the second air battle in my life." "At first we didn't believe it existed at all," O'Brien said, "but command probably didn't think so." Soon after the Soviet fighter pilots first reported this yak, we received orders to shoot down any suspicious aircraft of our type that didn't have a number or were attacking us. Just this yak was unnumbered, again inserted Lieutenant Kremper. I noticed it at once, but only did not realize at first what was the matter. It was for me such a devilish obsession. I was interested in his story. We sat down under a low bush to smoke a cigarette, and Kremper told us about his second air battle. Plane Yaks, led by Major Lisetsky, accompanied the attack aircraft on another mission. Lieutenant Kremper flew behind the leader in the second pair. The first pair, as a direct cover for Ailov, were Lieutenant Kalinowski and Chorunzhi Yavorski. This time Kremper flew behind everyone, a little to the right and 300 meters above. He perfectly saw all our planes. Not far from the Oder Kremper noticed a large group of our attack aircraft accompanied by fighters. They were probably returning to their airfield. The enemy planes were nowhere to be seen. They, in general, now rarely showed up near the positions of our troops. Between the Oder and the Frankfurt highway, our planes in the air became more. When approaching, Kremper easily recognized them by the Soviet identification marks. But here he noticed a lone yak going northeast course. At first Kremper did not pay attention to him. And only when the fighter came much closer and began to go into his tail, Kremper turned around to make sure once again that it was indeed a yak. Turning his head back, Kremper involuntarily pressed lightly on the right pedal and took to the right side of the control stick. Maybe that saved him. The airplane was slightly off course, and so the first line of shells passed almost next to his left side. All this lasted no more than a second. Evidently, in the next 1 or 2 seconds, the attacker made a correction as the target was moving away from him. But Kremper was so stunned by this unexpected attack that he didn't even think about it. For him, the close silhouette of the yak was always synonymous with safety. And suddenly these cues. "I'm imagining things," thought Kremper. But no, he did not dream. Yak, again, held him in the crosshairs and hit him. Kremper pressed the pedal as hard as he could and pulled the handle toward himself. The airplane did a flip and went down. The ground flashed first somewhere to the side and for a moment froze, motionless, right in front of the pilot. He took the plane out of dive and saw a yak with red stars on the fuselage, but no license plate. The fighter steeply turned around, trying to come in from above and in the tail of Kremper. Kremper made a turn with a gain in altitude. He saw the yak sharply tilted in a deep turn to catch up with him. Using such an advantageous moment, Kremper gave even more roll of the machine and rushed at the enemy. He carried almost plummeting downward, quickly took aim and already prepared to press the trigger, as again felt all the unreality of what is happening. In front of him, right in front of the barrels of his guns, was yak with red stars. Kremper immediately woke up, but the moment was lost. The enemy was already leaving. Kremper turned after him and, using the speed of diving, ran after him. Carefully aiming, Kremper finally opened fire, but the yak suddenly disappeared, lost in the dark background of some forest. There was no time to look for the enemy. Kremper realized that now the most important thing for him, to gain altitude. Overloaded engine roared and heavy pulling the plane up. Continuing to gain altitude, Kremper looked around and even made a turn to see what was happening behind him. But then he remembered the task, and he even stabbed in his heart. After all, he entered the fray, without a single word, without warning the commander of the link. Where is he now? He once again looked around and saw that the yak without a number disappeared, as if he was swallowed up by this thick, dark forest stretching below. Slipped away, damn him, thought Kremper. But where am I supposed to fly to now? He tried to remember how long the fight had lasted. A minute? 2? Maybe 10? Correcting his course, Kremper flew southwest. To the right above him he could see a network of canals around a small lake with embanked dams. The canals converged to a small town with a railroad station. Kremper oriented himself on the map. Oderberg, he thought. If there's a small lake further north, this jumble of canals will be the Fils Canal. He turned back, strained his vision, and far behind him he noticed the sparkling smoothness of a lake. There it is, the lake, but what's in it for me? Maybe I'll catch up with them yet, he thought. He stepped out to Steinbeck and set a course for Bernau. Even from afar he noticed some group of stormtroopers, and above them several yaks. Approaching, Kremler counted, they were 4. With the next group of Elov flew only a couple of yaks. No, so I will not find them, he said to himself. We need to request their own on the radio or return. At the same minute he noticed 4 more attack planes. 2 of the yaks kept just ahead of them, and 1 flew higher up on the left side of the formation. Kremper called the password and immediately heard the voice of Major Lisetsky. Well, at last you've found yourself. What happened to you? He replied that he was fighting. With yak, added, but he ran away. It's a pity, replied Lisetsky. Rare prey. Krempu surprised this somewhat ironic tone, but there was no time to talk and clarification. And only when we returned to the airfield, said the lieutenant, I learned that a few days ago Major Lisetsky also saw this yak without number. Kromy and Kalinowski also saw it, when the yak tried to sneak up on them from behind. But it failed to take any of them by surprise, and it immediately ran away as soon as they tried to attack it. Kremper added that to this day the story of this yak seems to him mysterious and unnatural, despite the reliable confirmation of such sober and judicious people like Kalinowski and Cromie. "This does not mean that I doubt the existence of this yak without a license plate," explained Kremper. "Only that the state I experienced when I met him seemed unreal to me, as if I had experienced it all in a dream." O'Brien shrugged his shoulders slightly and grinned ironically. He didn't see anything mysterious in the story. "I knew another fantasist of the same kind. He saw a lot of things too," O'Brien said. "Who was it?" I asked. "Wladek Żurawski," said O'Brien. "He also had an imagination, and he too had an unusual experience. We were raiding Felton at the time. That's northwest of Berlin, not far from Havel. In the raid on the city took part 6 ill, and the same number of our yak. I and my partner went at the same height, and Żurawski with 3 others, higher. Over Felten we were attacked by a whole pack of Fokker wolves. Those 2 pairs of yaks, which were above, spun with them in a merry-go-round. For each of our aircraft there were at least 3 Fokker wolves. In the meantime, we, together with the Illies, made an approach to Felten. Suddenly 2 Fokker wolves fell on us from above, like snow on our heads. It would have been all right if we could have dealt with them, but you know yourself, direct cover can only snap back. So we were snapping back while above us, 200 meters above, everything was boiling. We would surely have been hit then, because a couple more Focke-Wulfs came down from above and started pecking at us too, but fortunately 2 squadrons of Soviet fighters soon came to our aid. As soon as the Germans noticed them, they immediately gave gas and ran away. Well, and the Ilias, with their bombs, turned the railroad lines in Felten into Italian pasta and turned back home. We couldn't make sense of this mess and, worst of all, we couldn't count who was missing. And only afterwards, at the airfield, it turned out that Shirokun was killed. Many returned with holes, and Żurawski had a hole in his gas tank. He knew that he would not make it to Banówko, and on the way back he searched hard for some other airfield. Finally he found a suitable one near the Oder and informed us by radio. "It's a beautiful airfield, but for some reason the camouflage is worthless. The machines stand near the forest, like at an exhibition. They can be seen for 10 kilometers. Then he told us how he saw a duty officer with a flag and even a T laid out in the middle of the runway, almost like in the good peacetime. Żurawski made a circle over the airfield and slowly went to land. The engine, snorting on the last drops of gasoline, stalled in the air. Naturally, after the battle, Żurawski felt a little broken and was exhausted by uncertainty, whether he would be able to pull with punctured tanks across the front line. But now, seeing the airfield in front of him, he calmed down. True, he was surprised by the dead silence and immobility that reigned on this airfield. Except for the duty officer at the launch, he saw no one. He did not see a single mechanic, no sentry near the airplanes, not a single living soul. The airplane was rapidly losing speed and approaching the ground. The car stopped about 200 meters from the planes lined up in a row near the forest. The silence, like a coffin slab, as Wladek Żurawski put it, closed over his head again. The duty officer at the start continued to stand motionless with his flag lowered down. A sleepy calm reigned all around. Wladek later told me that then it seemed to him as if all the pilots and all the maintenance personnel had suddenly died of a broken heart, and the duty officer with the flag was petrified with horror. Żurawski climbed out of the damaged yak and unbuckled the parachute. His knees were trembling, and the calves of his legs were cramping. He walked very slowly, as if on someone else's legs, afraid that he would fall. Halfway there he called out to the duty officer, but he did not even move. He stood leaning forward in some unnatural pose, as if hypnotized. Żurawski, coming closer, called out to him several more times, to no avail. The immobility of this strange man seemed to him more and more suspicious. Wladek could not get a good look at him. The setting sun was casting its blinding rays from behind the back of the deaf paralytic, as the angry Żurawski mentally dubbed the man on duty. The silence, which was simply unbearable after the heat of the recent battle, began to piss him off. He looked around, but still saw not a living soul and heard not a single sound. At last Vladek got control of his legs and ran the few steps left to the duty officer. He grabbed the duty officer by the shoulder and shook him violently. In mute silence, the duty officer, without even flinching, stretched out on the ground at full height. Żurawski bounced aside like a grasshopper. Only after a moment did he realize that the mannequin in front of him was a skillfully made mannequin. He kicked it angrily with his foot. A fountain of sawdust rose up from the torn chest of the duty officer. Lost in speculation, Żurawski decided to look for a more talkative society on this silent airfield, which, by the way, was not in as good a condition as it seemed to him from above. He walked straight toward the airplanes at the very edge of the airfield. At almost every step he encountered numerous potholes. He congratulated himself that he had managed to land without breaking his neck on a fairly level stretch of this clearing, and wondered how the other planes took off and landed without breaking their landing gear. Having reached the first airplane from the edge, tired Żurawski leaned on the wing and immediately heard a crack and felt that he was falling. He collapsed to the ground with the plane broken off at the very base. Vladek weighed as if he had been bitten by a snake, a wing that could support a ton of load on 1 square meter. This wing had broken off under the weight of his body. From fear, aggravated by the dead silence, he was shaking all over. At last he mastered himself and began to grop cautiously around the airplanes. His amazement was unbounded. They were all made of cardboard and thin plywood. They were mere models, like the effigy of the launch duty officer. Until now, Vladek had never heard of false airfields. He was so shocked by this mysterious story that he jumped up again like a stunned man when he heard a live human voice. The voice belonged to an amusing and very angry figure, a sort of military male version of Madame Tussaud. The figure, in the uniform of a lieutenant, appeared on a bent lady's bicycle. The lieutenant opened his mouth and burst into such a profanity that it seemed to poor Vladek as if a pack of rabid wolves had pounced upon him. The lieutenant's anger was justified, and the confused Vladek began to understand something at last. He let the fierce airfield commander pour out his anger to the end, and then, unable to find an excuse for his destructive actions, confessed everything frankly. With this he somewhat bribed the angry lieutenant, who listened with evident pleasure to how his models had been mistaken for real airplanes, and by whom? By a pilot. In a quarter of an hour they were already friends. The lieutenant treated Żurawski to dinner, and the soldiers serving the airfield meanwhile pulled up Żurawski's yak to the last place in the row of plywood models. Now tell me, whose unusual story is more interesting? Mine about Żurawski, or Kremper's about the yak without a number? O'Brien asked. By the way, he added without waiting for an answer, the Germans did not let themselves be deceived and, with a rare for them sense of humour, bombed the false airfield with wooden bombs. We were returning along the bank of the Naro from a Sunday walk. We didn't have to fly over the sea very often, said Lieutenant Chovnitsky, only when we were assigned to accompany attack aircraft in raids on Kolobrzeg. But I had to fly over the sea and in the performance of completely different tasks. I want to tell you about one of these flights, although it may not be particularly interesting. You're not in a hurry, are you? No, I wasn't in a hurry. Now, talking to this educated, knowledgeable officer, I not only wanted to hear about the air battles he had conducted, but also to supplement the materials I had collected with information about the role of aviation in the 2 largest operations, in which the First Polish Army took part on the way from Warsaw to the Baltic coast. I asked Lieutenant Czernicki about the Pomeranian Rampart, about Kolobrzeg, and flights over the sea. His analysis of the events, precise and concise as a report, revealed the broad outlook of this outstanding officer. The command, apparently, highly valued his abilities, because a month after our conversation he was sent to the course of regimental commanders. On March 18th, Kolobrzeg fell, and we took the island of Gristov, continued Chovnitsky. It was not even an island, but rather a peninsula, connected to the land by a narrow earthen dam, something like a dam with locks. The first time I flew there with Major Gashin. He commanded our regiment after the death of Lieutenant Colonel Taldekin. The day was exceptionally sunny, and only a light haze hung in the clear air. We took off at 17 o'clock from Debsno. A faint northern breeze was blowing. At first we flew over the liberated territory. Below, on the ground, we could see traces of the recent fighting: burnt villages, blown-up bridges, hit tanks, abandoned enemy vehicles and cannons. The haze worsened visibility, and I saw Kolobrzeg when it was only 3 kilometres away. The white line of the surf sharply outlined the high shore. On it, among the dark green of the conifers, were the ruins of houses that had suffered a brutal assault. The sea was somehow faded, even whitish, almost like the clouds stretched out over it in long streaks to the north. It was only when we had gone far from the shore that the water beneath us became dark, and to the left it turned silver in the sunlight. We turned westward. Directly in front of us the sun shone with a soft, diffused light. To the right the sky and the sea merged so much that it was impossible to find a boundary between them. Turning my head in that direction, I experienced a strange sense of loss of balance. I could not determine the position of the machine in the air. Sometimes it seemed to me that the Earth's gravity was completely disappearing, and I was flying straight up into the sky, or head down to the ground. The higher we climbed, the stronger this feeling became. At a height of 3,000 metres we found ourselves in the milky blue that enveloped us from all sides. The sea beneath us and the barely visible shore in the distance seemed to disappear into thin air. The only real object was the sun shining in our faces. Never before had the space around us seemed so vast to me, even though visibility had decreased to perhaps 2 kilometres. Usually, when there are clouds or thick fog, the lack of space is particularly distressing. Now it seemed to me that I was hanging together with the airplane in boundless space, as if in the whole universe there was only the sun and our 2 yaks. I suddenly imagined that the engine had failed. What would I do in that case? That's funny for you to hear. Of course, I had altitude to spare and I would have reached the shore. But at that moment I was not laughing. The shore ceased to exist for me. It disappeared, dissolved into this milky blue expanse. I looked to my left, hoping to see the outline of land, but I could see no difference between the faded monochrome sky and the pale blue of what was obviously land. Only under the wing of the airplane did I see some darkish spot resembling the shadow of a cloud. "On the left is Gristov. Let's come in from the northeast," Major Gashin said, and I immediately woke up. Adding gas, I equalled Gashin's car. We were to dive and photograph, keeping wing to catch the enemy's air defences by surprise. There were so many anti-aircraft batteries on the island that we could not repeat the approach, or even dive one after the other. But for the time being, there was complete calm below. We knew that as soon as we entered the firing zone, this calm would be replaced by a fiery inferno. At low RPM, we made a smooth turn and from half-side entered the peak. The machines rushed toward the target. I felt the speed increase sharply. In front of me, as on the frosted glass of the camera, the land emerged from the milky abyss and began to emerge more and more clearly. I looked at the altimeter. The yellow arrow of the device was creeping down and had already passed 2,000. The hurricane wind was pressing on the cabin walls, and it seemed that they were about to break inside. At that moment, from the ground, from the reinforced concrete pillboxes and trenches, long strings of dense bursts came towards us. I saw them flashing blindingly bright between me and Gashin. They flew thicker and thicker, then getting closer, then suddenly scattered. Every moment I waited for an explosion, a jolt, a bang, or the clang of a shattered dashboard. Even though it only lasted a few seconds, I couldn't take it any more and pressed the throttle. I could see the tracks of my shells crossing with the tracks of the shells flying towards me. It's hard for me to say how or what I was aiming at. I was just shooting at the ground, which was shooting at me, and it helped me hold on for another 3 or 4 seconds against the instinctive urge to pull the handle toward me. We bore down like 2 heavy iron arrows and ploughed through the air in clubbing furrows that converged behind us with the noise and rumble of 100 waterfalls. Dropping down from a height of 2,000 feet, we began to bring the machines out of the dive at tremendous speed. I reached for the switch of the aerial camera. At that moment, my palm weighed probably 40 kilograms. A tremendous force was pressing on me, but it did not distract my attention for a moment, focused on staying with Gashin's plane. He had already switched to horizontal flight and added gas. The moment of transition of planes from dive to horizontal flight at an altitude of 1,000 meters was for us, perhaps, the most difficult in this flight. All the enemy guns, silent until now under the fire of our machine guns, suddenly came to life. Apparently, our sudden appearance stunned the Hitlerites, and they took our firing for a normal attack. To make an aerial survey, we had to fly for some time in a straight line at a given altitude. This was the most favourable moment for the enemy anti-aircraft batteries. Under the infernal fire, we could now neither manoeuvre nor shoot. There was nothing we could do to defend ourselves, and the only thing left to do was to change speed. It seemed to me that all this was taking forever. In fact, we did not fly in a straight line for more than half a minute. Then, as we came to the bay, we dropped down and went at a gentle glide. After passing Kamien-Pomorsky, we were racing northward over the very ground. The low forested shore suddenly disappeared from under the wings of my plane, and I found myself above the sea again. Major Gashin flew a little behind me and to the left. I reduced the speed, giving him the opportunity to overtake me. We were over the open sea again. Having lost sight of the shore, we climbed higher. We took a shorter route home. Before reaching Kolobrzeg, we turned to the southeast. It seems that the photos were successful, as none of ours flew to Gristov afterwards. A few days later, we learned that the attack squadrons had bombed the launching pads for the rocket planes on this island. To tell you the truth, I don't even know what they looked like, those shells. Chovnitsky finished his story, and we walked in silence for some time. A big, dark cloud was coming from the north and slowly covered the sun. The wind blew. It brushed the long, low-hanging branches of weeping trees and stirred the mirror-like surface of the water. Swarms of midges swirled over our heads, swallows swept noisily by, and wild ducks and flocks of sandpipers fluttered into the air from the marshy meadows. We turned onto the highway and headed toward town. There was silence all around. There wasn't a soul in sight. It was over 2 years ago. Chovnitsky spoke again. It always seems to me that the war ended recently, a few weeks ago, but 2 years have already passed. I would like to go to Kolobrzeg now. I've only seen it from an airplane during the war. Everything seems different from above. They say it's a very beautiful town. It's spring there too. It seemed to me that he was somehow surprised by his last words. Indeed, after that Kolobrzeg, which Chovnitsky saw during the siege in the spring of 1945, the present Kolobrzeg would seem to him quite different. At that time, he saw in this city only an area of military operations, in which he was interested only in fortifications, artillery batteries, communications, and the movement of transports and ships. Today he would see there the same peaceful picture as here: swallows flitting in the air, dancing columns of midges, tree crowns swaying in the wind. He would smell the forest near the Pomorsky stone. He would hear the sound of the sea surf rolling up on the narrow sandy beach, long shafts of waves which are thrown onto the sand and scattered with myriads of pearl-essent splashes. "You should definitely go there. I can see why you're drawn there," I said. "Yes, drawn like a criminal to the scene of the crime," laughed merrily Chovnitsky. "It seems that I will still be there." I immediately clarify. Goat MP stands for Goat Manu Propria, which in Latin means goat milked by hand, so jokingly nicknamed Lieutenant Podgorski by his comrades. I must make it clear at once that no one milked the bailiff. On the contrary, it was Lieutenant Podgorski who milked a certain goat long before he became a fighter pilot and a lieutenant. As for covering the attack aircraft in the attack on Vritzen, it happened even later, in the second half of April 1945. Before the war, Podgorski graduated from the officers' tank school. After the German attack on Poland in the fall of 1939, he found himself behind the Urals in an internment camp. There he was not spoiled at all. Like everyone else, he had to work in the heat and in the bitter cold, which, by the way, were much worse than the heat. At 30 degrees below zero, the locals said, "However, it already looks like a thaw." One went to work if the temperature was not below 40. But he was treated well, and his living conditions, like those of all internees, were no worse than those of the natives of this harsh land. In the winter of 1941, Podgorski contracted severe bilateral inflammation of the lungs. He was sent to a hospital in Perm. When the case began to recover, Podgorski learned that the Soviet government and the Polish emigrant government in London concluded an agreement on mutual assistance in the war against Germany and the formation of Polish military units in the USSR. After his illness, Podgorski was still too weak to travel immediately to the place where the Polish army was being formed. The first attempt to undertake such a journey ended miserably for him. The very next day at a train station, he fainted from weakness. A family of Polish settlers from a nearby collective farm took care of him. They took him in, and Podgorski stayed with them for some more time, until finally the young organism overcame the disease. But this time Podgorski was more careful and decided not to go on a long journey until he was finally stronger. He could not work in the field yet, and so when everyone went to work, he stayed in the house to manage and grazed a goat in the meadow, whose milk gave him back his strength. But now the fall came. He could no longer sit idle. Thanking his hosts for their care and bread and salt, he set off again. On the way, he met others like him, who wanted to join the Polish army, which was being formed somewhere in the central regions of Russia. So all winter of 1942, he wandered along the roads in search of the Polish army. Finally, he reached Chirchik near Tashkent, and here he learned that the Polish army, instead of moving west and fighting the Nazis, went to Iran. Podgorski did not understand the political background of this withdrawal. He was a soldier. He wanted to beat the enemy, and lost this opportunity. In the spring of 1943, Podgorski learned that somewhere near Ryazan is formed a Polish division. Not thinking long, he set off again. Finally, he reached the place and was immediately enrolled in the 1st Tank Regiment. He, a trained tanker, was accepted willingly. But when he learned that an aviation regiment was being formed in Grigorievsky, he wanted to go there. True, it was not easy to do it, but Podgorski achieved his goal and began to fly. His instructor, Lieutenant Anikin, a calm and experienced pilot, considered Podgorski a capable student. After 30 flights with Anikin, Podgorski made his first independent flight on a training airplane UT-2. Every pilot forever remembers his first flight without an instructor, the first combat mission, and the first air battle. MP Cozy's first combat mission was a patrol flight over Warsaw in September 1944, and he spent his first combat covering attack aircrafts in a raid on Vritzen in April 1945. 8 humpbacked Ilov were already making a circle over Barnovko when the fighters were just getting off to a start. In the first pair were Lieutenant Lubetsky and Lieutenant Podgorski, and in the second pair were Lieutenant Stackhouse and Korunji Veshkenitsky. And now the forest rushed towards the fighters. Then it went under the wings and pressed against the ground. Machines gained altitude, rose above the formation of attack aircraft. At this time, the Ilas flew over the highway, leaving Dembno on the left. Fighters attached to the attack aircraft on both sides. Lubetsky and Podgorski covered directly the attack aircraft, and Stackhouse and Veshnitsky, like sheepdogs guarding the herd, ran around, coming from behind, then from above, then from the sides. The strip of forest broke off, but not for long. The planes passed the highway and the railway line connecting Kostrazin with Szczecin and came to the steep bank of the Oder, overgrown with dense shrubbery. The forests stretched from Stara Rudnica in the north to Kostrazin in the south. The clouds were crawling at an altitude of 1,500 metres. There were small, bright blue gaps between them. The oblique rays of the sun shone especially brightly on the snow-white edges of the clouds and fell down in steep, blinding cascades. Suddenly 2 black dots emerged from under this glittering shower of sunlight and immediately disappeared into the murky clouds. They could have been mistaken for a pair of hunting hawks. But Podgorski's keen eye did not fail. They were airplanes. On the right, just under the clouds, I see 2 machines. They're over the river now, about Gustabiz. It seems that they are heading towards us, he immediately told the Lieutenant Lubetsky. Roger, he answered and began to call the second pair. Lisa 2, Lisa 2, Lisa 2, I'm Lisa 1, I'm Lisa 1, the headphones said. I'm Lisa 2, came back. I'm Fox 2. On the right, Lubetsky began. Stackhouse interrupted him half-heartedly. I see 2 messers. Leave them to us. Gaining altitude. Podgorski looked back and saw how 2 Yak, some 200 metres behind him, dodging to the right, began to gain altitude. The 2 Nazis probably had not yet noticed neither the attack aircraft nor their cover, and, without changing course, were coming aslant towards our Ilas. Podgorski even had a neck-ache, so he was turning his head in all directions, trying not to lose sight of the approaching messers and gaining altitude Yak. But at that moment, Podgorski again heard Lubetsky's voice. Look, Koza, don't blot it out. There are also a couple of messers below. Podgorski looked down and immediately noticed them. They were approaching from the northwest, from the direction of Staraya Rudnitsa. Against the dark background of the forest, the planes could be distinguished only thanks to the glare of the sun shining on the windows of their cockpits. They were sneaking up on our attack planes, which were clearly visible from below against the sky. Quick and skittish, they disappeared from Podgorski's sight, merging with the dark green of the dense forest below them. Podgorski's heart beat faster and faster. His nerves tensed like strings, and his temples began to pound hard. He was waiting for the attack. It was obvious that it was about to begin, and the guard was very worried whether he would be able to take at least one of them in the crosshairs. The Nazis were already close. Coming in from below and from the side, they soared upward, making a combat turn, and rushed at the last 2 sludge. M.P. Koza acted more nimbly. The lines of his guns cut the fascists the road. The shells probably passed very close to the target, for the Messerschmitts suddenly made a U-turn and rushed down. Podgorski was tempted to chase after them. He was sure that, having a great advantage in altitude and freedom of manoeuvre, one of them he will shoot down. But he couldn't. Not for 1 minute could not leave the attack aircraft without cover, and as a predatory falcon chained to a pole, with longing looks at the pigeons flying in the distance, so Podgorski looked longingly at the departing Messerschmitts. If I had been on a patrol flight, they would not have dared to behave so impudently. Then I would not have let them go, thought the lieutenant bitterly, and reluctantly mewed his seat over the Ilami, going flat stairs. Together with Lubetsky, he began to look out for the messers hidden below. Podgorski was the first to notice how the enemy planes came out of dive and again rushed up, preparing for a new attack. This time they were almost at the same height as him, and this prevented the gunner from firing immediately. He made a U-turn and pressed the throttle just as the Messerschmitts loomed over the horizon in his sights. Podgorski noticed that his shells were passing in a widely scattered fan, crossing the path of the Nazi planes. Then he immediately made such a rapid barrel roll beneath them that his eyes went dark. Suddenly he felt fear, as he could see nothing. Now he was completely helpless, and during those few seconds the Nazis could easily make a literal sieve out of him. In order to quickly return his vision, clouded by the ebb of blood from his head, Podgorski with an effort pressed his chin to his chest and all squeezed, every moment expecting a blow. He clearly imagined those sharp, lightning-fast blows as if struck with a club, and then the piercing pain in his back, in his head, in his side. He felt this supposed pain with every pore, every cell of his body, but not a single line hit his airplane. Meanwhile, the darkness was slowly dissipating. Podgorski saw first his hand resting on the control stick, then his feet resting on the pedals, and finally the outline of the cockpit. He raised his head. The horizon lay aslant to the wings of the airplane and floated upward, while the ground grew and grew closer with every passing moment. Podgorski levelled the airplane and looked up. Lobetsky was fighting the Messerschmitts. His short, vicious bursts made the Nazis turn and scurry away without a backward glance. It's good that he was in time, thought Podgorski, pulling up to his seat on the right side of the formation of stormtroopers. But they could have hit me hard. He suddenly felt terribly tired. Taking a deep breath, he ran his tongue over his parched lips and wiped the small drops of sweat from his forehead with the palm of his hand. Then, settling back into the seat, he asked himself, "Are they attacking again or not?" He was excited and reproached himself for having already missed the opportunity to shoot down the Messerschmitt twice. "I should have aimed better," he thought, "especially the second time. They were so close. All right, now I won't be a slacker. Let them just stick their heads in." But the Messerschmitts didn't try to attack again. They felt insecure. There were only 2 of them left, as the other pair, going higher, did not get involved in the fight at all and immediately turned to the west. Having flown over the Oder, our planes met a dense fire of anti-aircraft batteries. It intensified with every minute. Over Neulewin and Vritzen, they were again shelled from the ground. So they flew to the highway leading to Eberswalde. Here the attacking planes rearranged themselves into a combat order and formed a circle, so that from the direction of Schulzendorf, one by one, they could attack the Vritzen railroad station, which was jammed with trains. A few above them circled both pairs of fighters, ready at any moment to repel the air attack. But here the leading Ilov began the assault. Podgorski saw the hump-backed heavy machine rushing down. On the cars, roofs and windows of station buildings, on anti-aircraft installations whipped long lines. From the carriages were sent to death-frightened Hitlerites, the soldiers who were on the platform as if blown away by the wind. 2 high columns of earth rose one after another on the railroad bed. Sleepers and rails twisted by the explosion flew into the air. The nearest cars stood on their haunches and climbed on top of each other with a terrible rumble. Broken glass spattered from the windows of the station, and the roof, swept up by the blast wave, spread like paper, and, exposing one corner, spat out the beams as one spits out knocked-out teeth. Black death indeed, thought Podgorski, but the sludge was already sailing upward and making a new approach. He seemed invulnerable to the feverish fire of anti-aircraft batteries that covered the city from the west in a wide semicircle. "Fox 2, Fox 2, Fox 2, Fox 2. I'm Raven, came through the headphones. "I am Fox 2, I am Fox 2, Stackhouse echoed. "Go ahead. Cover the batteries outside the city," demanded the commander of the attack aircraft. Stackhouse called Weschnitsky, and they both rushed down. Meanwhile, bombs continued to fall on the station on stationary trains. Steam was pouring out of 2 perforated steam locomotives. Empty platforms and platforms were gaping craters. Broken cars and some warehouses were burning. High columns of smoke curving upward covered the city with a reddish blanket. It seemed that the task was already accomplished, but at the very minute when Stackhouse and Weschnitsky one after another opened fire on anti-aircraft batteries, the attack aircraft once again hit Vritzen. Jet shells ploughed through the huddled mass of railroad cars, and suddenly in this blazing dump began to explode boxes of ammunition. Only now the fire had reached them. Smoke billowed over the station. Everything there was now boiling, roaring, humming and sparkling like lightning amidst the black storm clouds that hung low over the ground. Now the attacking planes rained down on the anti-aircraft batteries, which, in fact, had nothing to defend, and their calculations after the first bursts of Stackhouse hid in hiding. The last bombs exploded on the hills behind Vritzen, and the last rockets set fire to a few more vehicles sheltered on the outskirts of the city. The return to the airfield went quietly, and no matter how much Podgorski wanted to meet at least one enemy plane in the air, he never waited for it. This first battle, which MP Koza spent covering the attack aircraft, filled the soul of the officer with bitterness and frustration. Although the battle ended in victory, but he was not able to shoot down any aircraft. During the entire second half of the day, Podgorski recalled every detail of the battle and reproached himself for not being diligent enough to aim. That gave 2 short lines. That did not chase the Messerschmitts, missing a great opportunity after their first attack, and in general was a stretch. He envied the attacking aircraft. The result of their raid did not cause any doubt, and he did not even know whether he had managed to kill at least one Hitlerite. In such a gloomy mood, he was seen by Lieutenant Lubetsky, who returned from a meeting of squadron and unit commanders. "What, Koza? Not cheerful? That hung your head?" he asked in a gruff and humorous tone, taking Podgorski under his arm. Podgorski mumbled something about his unsuccessfully fired bursts. "Well, it's no big deal," Lubetsky said encouragingly. "You probably wanted to have a Messerschmitt on your account immediately after the first line, or maybe even 2. Listen to me, Brother, the point is not to shoot down a Kraut. That's not our mission at all. The most important thing for us is to make sure that nothing happens to the Ilias. You know that very well yourself. It's been hammered into your head hundreds of times. But I know what you're looking for. You're looking for satisfaction. For what you've been through, for the fear, for the tension, for not taking a chance when you had the chance. But you realize that the stormtroopers have to be able to reach their target in peace, and that means that they must never doubt for a minute that you'll cover them in time, that you'll always be there, that you won't be tempted by any fight, that you won't take a single opportunity to, well, just like you did today. You'll be mad, you'll be angry, but you'll resist temptation. You have to worry about them, wring your neck to see everything around you, even die for them if you have to. After all, their mission is more important, and you see, so far there has never been a case that even one ill under our cover was shot down by a Nazi fighter. That's why the pilots of the attack regiment trust us more than the armour of their ill. And the trust of such people is worth something, huh? I was looking for you to tell you that the commander of the 3rd Regiment commended our wing for today's cover, and I thank you, brother, understand? Podgorski blushed. In fact, not for that, he began. I didn't want you to either, Lubetsky laughed. Don't be discouraged, Koza. Berlin is not far away. The day of April 25th was very hard for us, began to tell Lieutenant Schwartz. We were changing the airfield, because it was already quite far to fly from Barnówko to Berlin. Or rather, we were flying even farther from Berlin, and in order to get to the air reconnaissance areas located to the west of the Nazi capital, we had to circle it from the north. So we were changing airfields, which is always unpleasant. I was afraid that in the turmoil of relocating my toiletries, underwear and everything else would stick, as it usually happened, to some of my comrades so firmly that they would never want to part with them. And everyone understands how a man needs these little things in war, and in general, no matter how well organized relocation is, it always remains relocation. A man with a gypsy nature might not care about it, but I, you know, am a homebody by nature. Besides, on this day, the command did not cancel combat sorties. I was a little amused by such a statement of a man, whom fate threw from Poland to the eastern frontier of Asia, and from there to Kiev, and finally to Berlin. Obviously, at that moment he thought the same thing and smiled. It is true that in recent years I have not led a sedentary life, he said. Still, I'm a homebody by nature. So, I'm going back to that April day, Schwartz continued. I must say that the weather that day was abominable. Low leaden clouds, wind, cold, rain, and at times even hail. Only in the afternoon, when we flew to the new airfield, the sky cleared up a bit. We flew with stormtroopers on a mission. Which one? I don't remember. And when we returned, we learned that we were still waiting for a reconnaissance flight to the Neuruppin area. There, our advanced tank units, together with the infantry, were at that time engaged in a heavy battle for the possession of towns and the highway to Rathenau. I can't say that I had a bad feeling at that time. It was just that I was very tired, and I didn't feel like flying anywhere. Of course, it did not occur to me to turn away from this assignment, and indeed, I would never have admitted that I was tired after the flight. But I wouldn't have minded if something had interfered with our flight. I am not hiding this from you because you yourself are well aware of how sometimes one is in a foul mood and how sometimes one wants to rest. If someone were to tell me that he was always eager for a mission and never dreamed that the flight would fail, I would think of such a person that he either has not flown much or is lying. In short, I was not eager then to fly that mission. On the contrary, my leading officer, Sub-Lieutenant Haustovich, jumped with joy when he learned that we were flying. The weather was on his side. The clouds had risen to 600 meters, and there were even blue gaps in some places. That day the regiment had already made 38 sorties. Ours was the 39th. We took off at 1740 and flew behind the clouds. I like going on a mission to fly above the clouds. First, I am favourably affected by the contrast between the huge bright dome of azure sky and the grey shroud of clouds pressed low to the ground. Secondly, if they impose an unequal battle, you can easily go into the clouds. What I am telling you now does not look like heroism at all, but I think my frankness is more important to you than a thrilling tale of heroic deeds, don't you? I smiled and nodded silently. I wouldn't say that to anyone else, he said thoughtfully. I have no doubt you know how hard it is to tell such things about yourself. The truest picture of the fighting is given by the combat report, which is written after the mission and consists of only the bare facts. And you want me to tell you things that are not in the reports? I don't know if what I'm talking about will be of any use to you. I assured him that it would, and Lieutenant Schwartz continued his story. He was flying above a layer of clouds, experiencing a state that he himself called clarity of thought. Physical, even rather nervous fatigue disappeared without a trace. The pilots calmly walked above the clouds, on the uneven and swirling surface of which ran the shadows of two airplanes. These shadows then fell into the gorges between the steep edges of the clouds, and then again climbed on their white hills glistening from the sun. Thus they flew for some time. Our radio stations were checking their location several times. But then Schwartz heard Haustovich's voice in his earphones. He warned that they were about to break through the clouds. At such moments, every pilot is slightly excited, his nerves tense up, his heart starts beating harder, and all his attention is focused on one thing: how not to lose sight of his leader when coming out of the clouds. They almost simultaneously entered the thick whiteness of the clouds. The silhouette of Haustovich's plane began to blur in the warm matte light, as if draped in a thin curtain. The altimeter arrow slowly crept downward. For a while Schwartz's plane sank into the twilight, but then it became light again. The last scraps of clouds flashed past the cockpit, disappeared somewhere above, and Schwartz saw the ground. Immediately there appeared the indistinct silhouette of Haustovich's yak. His machine was becoming clearer and clearer every moment through the smoky canopy, and at last it was clearly visible against the background of a wide-spreading lake, around which the railroad and the winding highway looped. The lake was cluttered by the black, scratched-out truss of a damaged bridge in one place, a few red brick houses nestled on the shore. These houses, the railroad station and the nearby forest were covered with the smoke of fires. Some warehouses and factories were burning, as well as several ships and barges near the western shore of the lake. Along the highway coming from Alt-Ruppin and from the north, from the airfield, our infantry was advancing. The tanks, which had broken out ahead, came very close to the town. Meanwhile, from the railway station and Kirch, the Hitlerites undertook a counterattack. From the nearest cemetery, their artillery batteries put a barrage, blocking the roads leading from the north to Neuruppin. The Nazis did not spare even the city outskirts. They had already turned them into ruins. Schwartz took one look at the whole picture, and even before he heard Haustovich's voice in his earphones, he had oriented himself in the situation. "Attack the batteries in the cemetery behind the Kirche," said Haustovich, and entered the turn. Schwartz flew next. He took on sight the cemetery, hidden among the old overgrown trees, between which the frequent flashes of gun salvos constantly glittered. The Nazis well camouflaged their batteries. Only the sudden trembling of the branches and the flashes and quickly dissipating clouds after the next salvo gave away their firing positions. Schwartz took aim from a distance and, only halfway between the station and the Kirche, pressed the trigger. The trails of fire went into the thickest part of the trees. The gunner fired in short bursts, sweeping the cemetery from edge to edge, and tried to hit the flashes of fire glittering among the greenery. The battery's fire had weakened considerably and became indiscriminate. After flying almost over the trees, Schwartz soared upward. Beyond the lake he caught up with Haustovich, who was heading south toward the Alter Rhin River. Schwartz was a little discouraged that they had not repeated the approach and was about to tell Haustovich about it, but he heard him calling our ground radio station. "Fly to 777, transmitted soon Haustovich, receiving a reply from the ground. "I repeat, flying to 777. From there we will return to the airfield." 777 was the conventional name of Berlin, explained Schwartz, noticing my perplexed look. The station from which Haustovich spoke was called Amber and was only 15 kilometers from the outskirts of Berlin. So in 10 minutes we should have been there. This thought spurred me on. I had never seen Berlin before. "Berlin," he said thoughtfully, and then suddenly stopped talking. His deep dark eyes seemed to see at that moment the capital of Germany in those days. Berlin, spewing fire from thousands of guns and thousands of fires. Berlin, which was crumbling from the bursting of bombs and shells, smouldering and choking in clouds of lime dust from crumbling plaster, which was trembling in terror from basement to roof. "You know," said Schwartz, frowning his eyebrows, "you didn't see what the Nazis turned Warsaw into, but we saw it during the uprising and later. Maybe that's why each of us was so eager to be above Berlin, to look at its streets and spit into the lair of the Nazi beast with all our guns, to finally get rid of the bitterness accumulated over the years, caused by the sea of humiliation, resentment, and despair." Schwartz uttered this tirade with his fists clenched and his eyes glaring angrily. He quickly got over himself, however, and even seemed embarrassed that he had so easily succumbed to his feelings. Having calmed down, he continued to tell in the same measured tone how he and Haustovich passed the marshy floodplain of the river and turned to the east, directly to the northwestern outskirts of Berlin. Already from afar, you could see that everything was boiling and boiling there, as in a cauldron. A huge column of smoke over the city seemed to be propping up the clouds, which further to the west abruptly broke off just above the horizon. From the clouds rolled down a purple sun, as if sprinkled with ashes. The clouds were pink at the edges and purple in the centre. The column of smoke that supported them turned brown, then rusty, and finally began to resemble copper dust. This pillar under the gusts of wind kept changing its shape and shimmered in the rays of the setting sun, then gold, then bloody scarlet. But now, from behind the smoke screen appeared attack aircraft, covered by a link of fighters. They were probably returning from a mission, for they were flying northeast. Schwartz soon lost sight of them. He looked down at the ground, which, like the sky, was purple. The Grand Canal twisted through forests and fields, glistening like a hot wire, and reached all the way to the gardens and parks of Hennigsdorf. On both sides of the canal moved columns of infantry, vehicles and tanks. Here was a crossing at the very outskirts of Berlin, which down there lay all shrouded in fire and smoke, as Warsaw once was. But only Berlin had a powerful air defence and thousands of planes, while Warsaw could not even dream of it, said Lieutenant Schwartz bitterly, and after a moment's silence added, "You see, Our regiment flew to Warsaw at the end of August, and only in the first days of September, that is, a month after the beginning of the uprising, our fighters were finally able to drive away Hitler's bombers, but I'm not talking about that now. In short, the Nazis had something to defend Berlin. I saw it with my own eyes. First of all, I noticed 4 Focke-Wulfs, which came out of the clouds to our left, just where the Soviet attack planes and Yaks, returning from the mission, had just hidden. Immediately behind this 4, a second, and then a third, 4 airplanes appeared to our left. It sailed right over us without even noticing us. As I have already mentioned, the height of the cloud had increased, and over Berlin reached about 1,000 meters. Thus, the difference in altitude between us and the Focke-Wulfs was about 400 to 500 meters. In addition, the smoke thickened more and more, and visibility became much worse. Probably that's why the Nazis didn't notice us. I don't understand only one thing. Why didn't they attack the crossing? Perhaps they had already had time to use up their ammunition, or maybe they had another mission, the devil knows. But at the moment when this third force skipped over our heads, another pair of Focke-Wulfs appeared out of the smoke ahead of us. The planes flew a little lower than us, and so I did not immediately notice them. It seems that they were trying to reconnoitre or even attack our crossing. They began to make an approach to it. At the moment when they began to descend, we rushed forward. Haustovich threw to me on the radio, "Attacking the leader!" and immediately, like a kite, rushed from above on the Nazi plane. After the first turn, Haustovich Focke-Wulf Candle soared upward and obviously, for a moment, hesitated. Where to run away, left or right? This was his undoing. Haustovich frantically rushed after him and shot him at point-blank range. I was far enough away from my leader and, probably, thanks to this, I noticed in time that the partner of the shot-down Hitlerite with a combat turn goes into the tail of Haustovich. This second Focke-Wulf was right in front of me, and I did not even have to aim, as he himself got on my sight. I immediately pressed the throttle and gave it a long line. It seemed to me that my cues were very accurate and that, catching up with him, I was about to hit his tail, but he continued flying as if nothing had happened and was already catching up with Haustovich. And at that moment, oh horror, both my machine guns jammed. Wanting to warn Haustovich about the imminent danger, I shouted to him, "Nikolai!" But then my opponent, coming out of the turn, slid on the wing and slowly floated down. I did not immediately realize what had happened. I was seized with frustration and rage. The fascist was leaving me, clumsily framing his side, leaving only because I could not finish him now because of these damned machine guns. "Nikolai," shouted I, "my machine guns are jammed. There's a Focke-Wulf going down behind you on the left. For God's sake, hurry up or it'll be gone." Haustovich laughed loudly in reply. "He's already ready. My machine guns are jammed too." I thought he was mocking me, and almost burst with anger. But suddenly the Focke-Wulf took a nosedive, rolled over on its back and fell not far from the railroad embankment. I don't even know how to tell you about what happened to me then. I was in an indescribable rapture. I felt as if I had been miraculously pulled out of a damp, dark cellar into a bright, sunny world. I felt like a drowning man who had suddenly been thrown a lifeline. What can I say? All these comparisons are too pale to describe my condition, but you will, I hope, find better and brighter colours. That, in fact, is the end of it, continued the bailiff after some silence. But don't forget about our unfortunate machine guns. Probably you have already guessed why both me and Haustovich at the same time jammed all the machine guns. Only after landing, handing over my yak to the mechanics, I learned from them that the tapes of my machine guns were completely empty. And these 2 Focke-Wulfs we were counted without any dispute. After all, on the ground, at the crossing, there were many witnesses of our air battle. So, except for my new shirt and 3 pairs of socks, which again stuck to someone in the turmoil of relocation to a new airfield, this eventful day can be called very successful.